So welcome back. Thank you for tuning in. We have a really exciting schedule for you today. So the purpose of the first summer session was to jumpstart the program, get you familiar with what the program looks like and the kinds of issues that we discuss. But today's focus is going to be a little bit more focused on content. We're going to be focusing on Unit 3 and Unit 5 type topics, which we will get into, covering judicial review, incorporation, that sort of thing. So before we get started, I'd like everyone who is a CACE volunteer to briefly introduce yourself or reintroduce yourself for those who are joining in for the first time in a summer session. So my name is Sabrina McGraw. I am the president of California's Advancing Civic Education, which again is a program designed to help all California schools involved in the We the People program at the high school level. And we offer these summer sessions as well as support during the year at every stage of competition. We help put on practices. We have a robust number of volunteers that happen throughout the year, many of whom are lovely alumni. I am a current attorney in San Francisco working in insurance litigation at the firm Covington and Burling. I went to UC Santa Barbara for undergrad, Berkeley Law for law school, and I also clerked for a federal judge in Las Vegas. And so I've loved this program. This program is the reason that I do law. So I'm really happy to still be involved in it. So now I'm going to send it over to Nathan to introduce himself.
All right. Hi, everybody. Once again, if you were in the first session, my name is Nathan. I'm an alum of the program from Irvington High in 2015, 2016. I do not think we have that program at Irvington anymore, unfortunately. But yeah, I was Unit 1. I had a really fun time. I now work as a project manager in the Washington Metro. Um, and I did my undergrad at American. I followed up with grad school at Georgetown, so really big DC bent. And if you're ever wondering about local DC stuff and how politics plays into day-to-day life here on the East Coast, more than happy to chat about it.
Patrick?
Hi, if you guys were at the first session, I was also there, so I'll reintroduce myself. Hi, my name is Patrick. I'm a Foothill alum from last year, so 2024. I was Unit 5 when I did it, and we placed third at the national competition. So I think one of my other team members should also be joining, so we'll have another Foothill alum. But other than that, I'll be attending UC Berkeley this year, studying civil engineering and business. But this sort of but politics and government will always be my second love. So I'll always be glad to come back and join one of these calls. So looking forward to the call today.
Great. And then Katie?
Hello, everyone. My name is Katie. My pronouns are she, her. I am an alum of the program also from 2015, 2016, and also from a school that doesn't have the program anymore. I was in Unit 6. After that, I went to college for political science, and then I worked in the California State Legislature for 3.5 years. And then I did a major career pivot, and now I'm a park ranger for the National Park Service. So, happy to talk about California legislature stuff. Happy to talk about the Park Service. It's all wild. You can end up doing many different things from this program. I do a fair amount of historic I'm an interpretive park ranger. That means I'm an educator. So I do a lot of ecology stuff, but also a fair amount of history. And this also plays into that. So yeah, nice to re-meet y'all for folks that were here last time. Nice to meet you for folks that this is your first session with CASE, and really looking forward to seeing how things go for you this year.
All right, thanks, folks. And we do have other CASE volunteers who will be joining us later in the call. But for now, I am pleased to introduce Emily Voss, who is the Center for Civic Education, Manager of National Programs, and the Director of the We the People National Finals. She's going to speak to you about the center's program. So Emily, take it away.
Yeah, thank you all so much for being here on a weekend. I'm really excited to be able to chat with you for a few minutes. As Sabrina mentioned, Center for Civic Education, obviously we do a lot more than just produce your textbook. We the People is one of our flagship programs, along with Project Citizen. And so in addition to obviously producing your textbooks, we also train your teachers. So in every state, we have different summer institutes where teachers go through the exact same get to know the hearing process that you're going through this week. And it's really fun. Some of you might be feeling a little bit nervous about the process, and I can assure you that all new teachers feel exactly as nervous as you do going through the hearing process for the very first time. So we train your teachers, and then we also offer them additional support as well, so that they can also keep up to speed on the new developments of the Supreme Court, as well as new historiography of the American Revolution and the founding period. So we do a little bit of everything in that respect. Also, we do organize your national final events. So that's one of the most exciting things I get to do. I love seeing the teams that come to BC. Everyone is so thrilled and excited to be there, and everyone has worked so hard, and they're just eager to have a great conversation with the judges. So kind of the lead up to that looks a lot like us reaching out to guest judges, seeing if we can put together just the right mix of folks. We always try to recruit alumni volunteers to help at the national event, whether it's as judges or as other volunteers, because just like your CACE volunteers, it's so amazing to see where the different alums for We the People have ended up in their professional lives. So some of them, as we know, go into law, some of them go into history fields, some of them do something completely different, but they're all really eager to give back to the program as well and to work with the incoming students. So it's just a really neat way to see the program kind of come full circle in that respect. So we're recruiting volunteers, we're busy writing the questions. And then last year we rolled out the new scoring rubric, which I know you'll be doing a deep dive into as well. So our program is different every year because of course the questions change every year, but we're also, always working on ways to keep the program fresh and keep it really the best possible experience that we can give you as students. So last year that meant taking a hard look at the old scoring system and saying, this is not necessarily reflective of the kind of experience that we want students to be able to have. So we were able to rework the scoring system, and now you have a new rubric. So it's going to be a little bit different every year, small tweaks, large tweaks. But no matter what, at the end of the day, we're excited to be able to put on an event that allows you to be able to show off all the interesting new arguments you're ready to make, and to have those really high quality discussions with the guest judges. So that's a little bit of what we do. When I was able to speak to last year's CACE students, I left a lot of time for Q&A because you all might have a lot of questions for me about how nationals works, how any of the other behind the scenes things work. So I am happy to answer questions about anything you might want to know.
And feel free to put questions in the chat directly to me and I can ask them of Emily, or you can turn on your camera and your sound and ask them directly. I'll start us off because I have a question. I'm curious how the center went about approaching the new rubric. Like, what was the process like?
Oh, sure. So we had a task force actually of different kind of stakeholders. So we had folks who were We the People teachers. We had folks who were We the People judges, in addition to staff members. So folks who came at that process from a lot of different lenses, because in addition to the competition, that scoring rubric also needs to work for classroom teachers who do not choose to compete. So if a teacher is just using the material in the classroom, the students do still need to be able to get feedback on their opening statement and their follow-up arguments as well. And so we we wrote that new rubric with that in mind. And the way that we structured the opportunity to provide comments, both comments to say this is where you went above and beyond with your argument, and a space where someone could provide feedback to say this is what you might have done better. So we wanted to make sure that that kind of structure was in place. And then we also modified some of the descriptive language so that it wasn't always necessary to specifically reference the US Constitution for every single unit, because not every single unit lends itself to a reference to the US Constitution text. So for example, units 1 and 6, that's often a really big challenge. If you're answering a question about foreign affairs, if you're answering a question about John Locke, there's not always a clear and obvious connection to the US Constitution text. So we wanted to change the description so that it includes constitutional principles, not just the text. So allowing it to be a bit more broad. So anyway, that was a lot of discussions, a whole lot of editing. It took us, I think, 4 months, start to finish, to get to the final product.
Great, thank you. And I have a question coming in from a student. Says, what advice would you give to students who are just starting out in the program who plan to do a competition?
I would say have a lot of fun with it as much as you possibly can. We will be posting the state level questions August 29th. So I will tell you that up front. 29th of August, that's when you'll see the questions. And when you see them, I think really the first thing to do is just think as broadly as possible about those different questions and read as broadly as possible. So it's much easier to start big and narrow down as you're working on those opening statements and arguments. But yeah, that's what I would suggest is start big, work down to small.
Great. And just to clarify for students, we actually use a different set of questions for the initial competitions and state.
You can ignore what I just said.
But it still applies for once you are in your units and looking at the regional questions. I got another question coming in. It says, what advice would you give to students who are experiencing quite a bit of imposter syndrome coming into the program?
Oh, well, okay. First, let me tell you that everybody feels like that. So no worries. And no one is expecting you to be, a legal genius coming into this. Nobody has that background. This is a learning experience for literally everybody, including your teachers most of the time. So really don't worry about that at all. Everyone is coming into this from a learning mindset, from a growth mindset. And everyone is, I think the best part about working in teams is that you all get to do this together, that it's never going to be just you. It's always going to be a team. And yeah, your team is there to support you just like you are there to support them. So yeah, it'll be just fine. And I promise nobody is coming into this with like a Harvard degree.
So you might be able to school some people with Harvard degrees after you finish the program.
That's true.
All right, do we have any other questions from students or CACE volunteers?
Last year, a couple of CACE volunteers asked me how they could get involved in the national competition. So if you all ever want to do that, just be in touch with the Center for Civic Ed. We are more than happy to help find opportunities for volunteers, both at the national events, but then also at state level events too. So our state coordinators, in California, it's Cheryl Quicalio. All of our states have state level programs, and every single one of those state level programs is very eager to have alumni volunteers. So if you decide to, go to college in Arizona or Michigan or Texas, there are programs in all of those states that would love to have you as a
Okay, great. Any other questions? Final call. Hearing none. I really appreciate you taking the time, Emily. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Of course. Well, thank you for everything that you're doing, and everybody, good luck this week. Really have fun. This is meant to be a fun program. So good luck, and enjoy.
Thanks. Alrighty, so next on the agenda, we are going to take another deep dive into the score sheet, but this time on the remaining two categories, which is the opening statement and evidence.
Can everyone see this?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. So, score sheet round 2, so fun. So last time, just for folks that weren't here, just to kind of talk a little bit about it. And also, I don't think we've mentioned this yet. We're recording this. Like anything that happens in a breakout room won't be recorded, but stuff in the main room will be recorded. So if you have classmates or folks that you're with that aren't here today, or you weren't here for session 1, it is possible to get the materials and stuff. So, definitely feel free to check that out. But just to talk a little bit about what we talked about last time, we talked about the last 3 segments of the score sheet, which is analysis, application, and discussion. But today we're going to talk about the first 2 sections of the score sheet, which is the opening statement and evidence. So this is a change from before. It used to be on the score sheet that there were 6 total categories, and every category applied both to the pre-prepared opening statement part and the, unscripted anything, whatever happens Q&A section. That is no longer the case. Now your opening statement is in a category of its own, separate from kind of what happens during the Q&A or hot seat, depending on what your school calls it. So to give a quick kind of overview of how competition works, there are each unit, right? Your school will be divided up into units. Each unit gets 3 kind of questions that you are working on. Those questions all have kind of 3 main components and kind of an umbrella part and then 2 bullet points. And you will be spending time crafting a written statement in response to that. So that is what the opening statement is judging, is your pre-prepared written statement that you'll be presenting at the start of competition. So, as it says here, kind of in the scoring guidelines and information, you're going to be working on writing a well-organized and clear speech based on the questions from your unit. This is an interesting challenge, I will say, because it's a little bit different than the kind of writing you are generally doing during school, right? We do a lot of essays during school, but those are essays that are intended to be read as opposed to essays, speeches that are intended to be listened to. So it's a little bit of a different vibe to be writing, for an audience that is not reading your writing, but is in fact hearing your writing. So you want to be really thoughtful about your organization, even more so than in your kind of normal writing process. You're going to want to think about how you're signposting things for your audience, how you're helping bring the judges along with you so they can follow the arguments that you're making, and making sure that, it kind of rolls off the tongue in a clear way and is perceived in a clear way as well. So your whole unit will be working on this together. So you'll be working on it during the writing process, and that will be a big chunk of kind of your starting time here, is thinking through what you want to say, how you want to answer the question, how you want to approach it. You're probably gonna mess with it multiple times throughout your journey with We the People. Your first draft is not going to be your last draft, which is totally normal, totally part of the process. And when we were talking last time about kind of bonding with your unit mates, you're gonna spend a lot of time working on these opening statements together. So it's a good chance to do research. It's a good chance to bond. It's a good chance to connect. You will also all be taking a part of delivering that written statement. This means that, you'll divide it into segments. People will kind of read their segments. Different schools have different approaches. You are allowed to read it. I know that there are some schools that I've encountered in the past where they memorize things. Not necessarily a requirement, but like listen to your teacher about how they want you to do things. It's really important for this to be accurate. You want to be using evidence, history, the Constitution to kind of bolster your written statements. So the things that we're looking at in terms of the scoring is addressing all elements of the question. As we were talking about, right, those questions have a couple different parts. There's an overall question and then 2 sub-questions. You need to clearly address all parts of it. And this is where that conversation around how we right for an audience that's hearing us versus an audience that's reading us really comes into being. You might address all parts of the question, but your judge, if it's not clear when you're moving between parts, your judge could miss that we're actually talking about a different part of it, and they might not perceive it as having answered all parts of the question. So being really clear about when we're making a transition from one topic to the next really helps the judges follow. Because I'll tell you, when I've judged, I am scribbling notes at a fast and furious pace, and it's very possible to miss something. So we try our best to help to follow as closely as possible, but it's always really helpful for your judges, you are not the only school that they are seeing that day, to be as clear as possible. The other scoring criteria, all students are participating in the presentation of the opening statement. This is easy. This is not a hard thing to do. You just got to make it that everyone reads segments of it, and divide it up kind of fairly and evenly across your group. You'll get a sense of how to do that with your teachers in your classroom as well. And then the last part, right, being well organized and logical in response to our statement. We're using appropriate and accurate references to the Constitution. We're using scholarly sources. We're using relevant cases, legal opinions, historical documents, and other materials to substantiate their arguments. Are you necessarily doing all of those in every single one? Perhaps not. It depends on what the question calls for. And that's, I think, what Emily was talking about with kind of a different approach to how we talk about evidence in this new version of the score sheet, where there are different kinds of evidence, different kinds of sources that might be appropriate for different questions, for different units. So you want to be using what makes a solid impact, what helps convey your argument, and is clear and understandable for your judges. That's more important, right, than like totally packing it chock full, where we don't also get like an understanding of how you feel about it or what your take is. So as always in this course and in this competition, you want to be making an argument, taking a stance, saying something that you like have your opinion in there, and backing it up with evidence and backing it up with the appropriate evidence. There's a lot of stuff you can use. And so it becomes an interesting process of thinking through how you want to do things. A couple other things to note about opening statement, and we will work with you on this kind of stuff in the future. As we've talked about in the previous thing, CACE volunteers are around to read drafts, to talk through kind of potential ideas about where to take things, to make sure things make sense. So please use us as a resource. We love doing that. But there's some things to think about as well with the opening statement that's a little bit less on the scoring front, but is more about setting yourself up for success. And that's thinking through, kind of how to set yourself up for an interesting and fun Q&A that like has questions that you want to be engaged on. Sometimes that kind of lends itself towards, thinking through what topics you want to discuss in the opening statement, things that you might get follow-up questions on, and setting yourself up to like have a conversation that is interesting to you during the Q&A. That's something that is more of a refining thing. It's something that we are happy to talk about further as we get a little bit further down the road, but just a thing I wanted to mention. So yeah, that's the opening statement. Do we have any questions so far? Feel free to drop them in chat, raise your hand, all that. But I'll hold for just a second and then we'll move on to evidence. Also, can everyone read this? Did I make it big enough for folks to read clearly? Okay.
One thing I just wanted to add is, and
Yeah.
Katie mentioned this, that you will rewrite your testimony. I think just remember that when you're going into this process, remember you're going to rewrite it like 2 days before the competition, potentially, depending on the like feedback you're getting from judges. And so don't be afraid to change it. It's really important you're like listening to the people doing the practices and taking in their feedback. It's different than when you write an essay and you submit it to the teacher and you never look at it again. It's not like that. So just remember, iterate, 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 and that's going to make sure that your presentation is strong. Because again, you're going to be writing this when you first get the question, and you'll be writing it at a time where maybe you haven't done the research as much as you will later on. So you're going to be constantly informed by the new information that comes at you. And so again, just really important to remember, you should be rewriting. And if you don't rewrite, then you're probably doing something wrong.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think just an important thing to keep in mind is that you will get a lot of feedback. I know it can be really stressful sometimes to put work that you've worked hard on, that you're actively working on, in front of other people and have people see it. Um, Everyone who is a volunteer, who is working with your classroom, who is a judge, like, we are primarily invested in you having a good time and in your success in this program. So none of the feedback is personal. None of the feedback is there to, like, to be mean. I know it can be intimidating, but really you will know a lot and you'll be doing some incredible things as you work through this program, and all of the feedback is there to help you grow. So I feel like CACE, your CACE volunteers, but also just with the We the People program in general, is a really helpful way to get, like, comfortable with feedback, and with kind of that iterative process of editing and rewriting and editing some more, which may look a little different than how you've experienced some of your other kind of assignments and processes. This is just a really different kind of class. I remember feeling that, when I was a student in the program. So it's another thing to remember. Pretty much most people who are going to be judging you or working with you at some point went through this or have a connection to this program where they understand what it feels like to be in that student seat. So we're here for you and with you. It's not an adversarial relationship at all. So evidence is really important, and it's its own category here on the score sheet. We see some chat. Okay, quick question. When will the unit questions for our opening statements be posted during the school year? The questions for your first round of competition are the same every single year. So those are out there. If you go to, if you go online to the Center for Civic Education, like, it's there, we can link it in chat. The questions for the state competition and national competition, if you continue to that level of competition, those are different every year, and they tend to be kind of topical. I think Emily said that they will go up, state competition questions will go up at the end of August, but yeah, you could take a look at the district questions, the first round, they're there. Sabrina has linked them in the chat. And then, yeah, the state and national ones will come out later. Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate people asking questions. Feel free to continue to ask questions as we go. All right. Evidence. So evidence is really important in this, in this class, in this competition. We're making an argument, we're doing things, and the way that we make good arguments and the way that we are convincing and the way that we, help kind of share our thought process is by backing that up with evidence. So during kind of the follow-up question period, this is what the evidence category is looking at, right? Because the opening statement is its own separate score. So when we're talking about the other things, this is looking at how you use evidence during the follow-up question period. So you want to make sure you're backing up your ideas with proof. This can look a couple different ways, right? So we can reference the actual text of the Constitution, understanding the core constitutional principles at play with the question, and being able to point at specifically, not just like, oh, it's in the Constitution, but specifically where in the Constitution does that idea kind of arise. That helps make it a better, right, citation than just like, oh, in the Constitution. The Constitution has a lot of different parts. Constitutional principles, which can show up right in the text of the Constitution itself, in documents like, the Federalist Papers and stuff, that are kind of conversations around the creation of it, in philosophy that influenced the Constitution, in present day writing about it. There's a lot of different places. Turns out, when you've been having this conversation around this document for over, for a very long time, it means that there's a lot of places where there's conversations and citations and places to pull evidence about the Constitution from. And then other important sources to support your arguments. This also means looking at history, right? We talked about that a little bit before. Events from history, important people, those kinds of things show that we understand the context of the question. For example, in Unit 2, if we're having a conversation around some really early kind of American history, constitutional questions from early American history, understanding what historical events precipitated those, questions and conversations builds a more thoughtful and deeper answer. This is true from, early historical periods to the present. Like, what is the context that all of this is sitting in? It's also really important to talk about real life examples from the present day. As we talked about last time, it serves you really well as a student in this program to be paying attention to the world around you, to be learning about what's going on, to follow, important updates, important information along the way. So that way, it can come up thoughtfully cited, used in a clear and specific way as evidence, but it can come up in these conversations. So some kind of scoring criteria for this: accurate references to constitutional text, principles, and other relevant primary and secondary sources to support their arguments. So 2 things to point out here. Accurate, right? We want to make sure that when we're using evidence, we're actually using that evidence to make the argument that the evidence supports. We want to be careful about making claims about specific things. We want to be able to back up those claims with evidence that actually supports the claims that we're making. And then supporting your arguments. Again, argument is important here. It's not it's not the goal of the program is not simply to list a whole bunch of facts. The goal of the program is for you to make, as a group, an argument, something that comes from your own head, that is opinion based, that is then backed up in evidence. So your evidence is not there to just be a fire hose of information, but is there to back up the take that you have on this particular question. And that's the thing that makes it interesting. That's the thing that judges are able to engage deeper on. That's the thing that we really enjoy talking about. And the thing that, let me be honest with you, you're going to enjoy talking about the most too, is kind of that version of it. Next criteria, reference historical events or influential figures to demonstrate a contextual understanding of the question. So, right, we want to be thoughtful about, the past, about the ways that this interplays into history and into the kind of broader world in which this sits. As we talked about last week, this can also look like pulling references to other places than the United States. It can be really helpful to do kind of compare contrasts between different countries, different approaches of doing things. This is obviously a US Constitution based course and competition, but that's not the only place that you can pull your information from. If you really like how a different country is doing things, or really disagree with how a different country is doing things, those are conversations that can be had and can help kind of put additional context, additional perspective on hey, the way that things are done in the United States is not the only way that things can be done. And then the last criteria here is provided historical or current day examples or case studies that illustrate the real world impact of the Constitution or constitutional principles. So, right, this can both be from history and the current day, but we want to be using, real examples from the real world that show how this stuff actually plays out. I think sometimes we end up in a world where we're talking about theory, where we're talking about kind of ideas, and those ideas in politics and in this world have material impacts and material consequences. So it's important to talk about that. It's important to kind of put the perspective of what does this idea mean when we translate it into action? What do we see in this world as a result of, of this case, of this conversation, of this, whatever we are talking about. So that is kind of a quick rundown of evidence. Do we have any questions or things that we are curious about? Chat. Okay, I have a question here that has come directly to me. How do you know where to find evidence? Great question. There's a lot of different places, but we want to be thoughtful about where we're pulling evidence from. So same rules, you know, as kind of your general class, any sort of class that you're doing go, right? We want to be thoughtful about the quality of the sources. So, you know, a news outlet that's like not reputable is not a place to be pulling your evidence from. There are also, and I'll turn this over to, I think, Sabrina and some of kind of our more lawyerly minded friends, some really good places for kind of case law and other resources that, as not a lawyer and not an expert in that kind of way, I know less about. But yeah, being thoughtful about where we pull our evidence from is really important for ensuring that it is actually quality evidence and not just someone's opinion. Your opinion does matter, but we do want to be pulling, you know, thoughtful and clear evidence. But yeah, I'll turn it over to some of our case volunteers for some additional recommendations there.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so CACE will be providing a tips and tricks sheet and go over it in the next summer session, which will include where to go to get some sources, but some things just to keep in mind, and we can tell you this once you're starting with the program, but just so you know that these resources are out there, there's this great website called Oyez, O-Y-E-Z, which has basically a really great summary of every major Supreme Court case and sometimes other non-Supreme Court cases. That's a really great source to find the existence of cases. You can also always look at the actual text of those cases in like official government sources like the Supreme Court's website. Again, I think the best place to go in the first instance is to the actual government websites. If you're like looking at a bill from Congress or legislative history from Congress, going to Congress's website for that information. Also, the government has a wealth of statistics and analysis on different policies and the different people. There's the US Census data. And so really a quick Google will help kind of find those information off the bat. And then the other thing I wanted to say is there's this great website called SCOTUS blog, which is where really smart people who are often actually lawyers in front of the Supreme Court are doing an analysis of cases that are coming up to the Supreme Court or analysis of cases that just came down, or also cases on the shadow docket, which is cases that the Supreme Court has declined to review. And so the lower court is the one that stands, and those can often have an impact on what case law is going on. So the point of this program is not that you need to do original research on your own and then come up with your own ideas for every little thing. It's really important that you look at the base evidence, but also you can rely on legal scholars and people really knowledgeable. So also using Google Scholar feature to find legal analysis of what's going on some of the major issues, and also historians talking about those issues. You can and should use really smart people who have thought about these issues, and you can reference them as evidence for a lot of your theories and analysis. And I see both Patrick and Nathan turned on their camera, so I'll let them also give some advice here.
Yeah, I'll jump in just for a sec. I do want to second what Sabrina said about SCOTUS blog. While I was competing, every morning I got an email from SCOTUS blog with like daily updates on the Supreme Court and new articles that were coming out about what the Supreme Court was deciding, oral arguments that were happening. And it was just a really great resource to sort of keep updated on current events. And if you guys want to subscribe to their daily or weekly email blog, that's a great resource. And then the other thing that I'll say, as Sabrina mentioned, going to like Congress's website and looking at the actual acts themselves. If you're dealing with either a congressional act, a Supreme Court decision, or a executive order, any of those sort of primary sources, usually almost always when you go find them online, they'll have sort of like a one-page summary right at the top. And any Supreme Court decision has what's called I think it's I want to say a syllabus right at the top, where it's like a page or two summary of the entire like 100, 200 page opinion. And so instead of trying to read, you know, a 100-page opinion that Clarence Thomas wrote, those little summaries at the top, they're usually created by clerks at the court or at Congress. You can usually just reference those summaries, and those are still a really great primary source, and it's accurate since it's still coming directly from the source. You just don't have to necessarily read through an entire decision or an entire congressional act. So those are really great resources for me.
And my quick tip is primarily from my Unit 1 experience, but I advise everybody, regardless of what unit they eventually get sorted into, you're going to want to know some of the philosophy behind it. And philosophers are notoriously bad at getting things online well. So I would make sure, spend a day or two in a library, ask a librarian where these books may be, where opinions on different philosophers are, how to help. Because they will know and reduce your searching time a lot. Um, and yeah, once you have those sources, it is good to have like the meta-analysis of whatever John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau is saying, but it's worthwhile for everybody to read at least some of it, depending on what unit you're in, sometimes more intensely than others. Um, but really parse what they're saying. I know it's really hard to read sometimes because it's Old English and really, or Greek or Latin, and it's just so mind-boggling. But really taking the time to sit down and parse it out yourself, because a lot of these treatises and philosophical works and theories are meant to be parsed over by the reader. Um, so that's my tip for that sort of class of evidence outside of the legal sphere.
Thank you, Nathan. And yeah, I'll just give a general pitch for librarians. In general, they are professional researchers. They know a lot. If you are looking for places to find things, a library is always a good place to go. And yeah, definitely recommend. Another thing that I think is also, important to think about, is working with your other units. So, as we talked about, right, in your class, you're going to be divided up into units. Units have different focuses. It's really important anytime your other units are going during practice, during a competition, to be listening to what they're saying. Because you might learn something really cool and really important that could come up in a future question. You might get a cool piece of evidence from talking to your classmates, because you're all doing research, you're all deep diving into this question, and they are a resource for you as well. As well as so many of your schools, right, you're working with CACE folks. You may also have, kind of school specific alumni or volunteers that come and help you out. They're going to have some ideas about some places to go as well. It's a big process. It's a lot to learn, but there are, things that help make it more manageable. And over time, it becomes easier as you go along. So thank you so much for the fellow CASE volunteers for sharing your perspective on some sources for evidence as well.
Great. And do we have any other questions? And it can be about any part of the rubric. Okay. Seeing none, we are going to turn over to an overview of checks and balances. So I'm hoping Nathan can share his screen for me so I can do that. Okay, great. So you all should have this material. It's in the link I sent you for the summer session 2 materials. This is a great reference sheet to remind you of the different checks and balances. This is probably something that you learned last year in your history class or you've heard before. Oftentimes it's discussed with Montesquieu, who is the philosopher that the founders actually relied on for this idea of checks and balances, of 3 branches working together, but also preventing one branch from overtaking the power. You saw a preview of this in the last summer session where we were having the great debate about the most powerful branch and how each branch can interact. So now I'm just going to go over kind of sort of the details of that. And all of these checks and balances are in the Constitution itself. So first is the executive branch. The primary goal of the executive branch is to have the president carry out the laws, and there is an entire bureaucracy behind that to help the president achieve that goal. But as part of the president, the president and the judiciary or the executive branch has checks on the other two branches. So in this first column, you'll see the checks on the legislative branch. The executive can propose laws, so that means he or she can control the narrative or use the bully pulpit of one person sort of having a national focus to drive what Congress does. And so that's not necessarily one that's explicitly in the Constitution, but it is a part of the check on the legislature because the president commands a lot of focus and they can direct what laws should be in place. The president, this is a constitutional power, can veto laws. So even if the both houses of Congress pass a bill, the president can veto it. And then it would have to go to a supermajority in order for it to actually be passed. So this ensures that the executive branch is sort of in line with the legislative branch, or that the legislative branch is so certain that their law is correct or the right way to go that they can overtake the executive in that way and overrule that veto. The executive branch, the president, can also call special sessions of Congress to, again, drive what's going on and control the legislative branch and how it's viewed by the public and what kinds of things it takes on. And the executive branch can also make appointments and negotiate foreign treaties. So these are kind of legislative adjacent roles that the president can take on. And also with the Foreign Powers Act, the president is able to enter into certain military actions without explicit approval from the legislative branch within a certain number of days, and there are some restrictions, but this has allowed the president to wield war in a way that the legislative branch has usually supposed to declare war itself. And so this is a check in some way because the president is able to control how the legislature does that. And the checks on the judicial branch, I think, are a little bit more clear cut. The president, as I think we've all discovered, appoints federal judges, including the Supreme Court. And this is a check because the president can essentially control to some degree what the judicial branch actually decides. So we saw in the last couple of years, President Trump's appointments to the Supreme Court have controlled the narrative and controlled the outcome of many cases, including on abortion and many other items that were previously decided by other presidents' appointments and went a different way. Additionally, the executive branch, the president, can grant pardons to federal offenders. So even if the judiciary determines that someone is guilty, the president can issue pardons or can commute a sentence, which means make it shorter, even if they are found guilty. And so the president can kind of control the judiciary in that way. Next, we had the legislative branch. Congress' main goal is to make laws, but they also have a number of checks. So as I mentioned before on the executive branch, the legislature can override the president's veto. But it's a check on the legislative branch to some degree because it has to be popular enough among the legislators in order for that to be overridden. The legislature also confirms executive appointments. So even if the president can appoint federal judges, the legislature gets a say. And previously, I think this has been more of a rubber stamp kind of approach, but the legislative branch has wielded a lot more control and power in recent years about their ability to confirm executive appointments. A good example of this is Neil Gorsuch not being confirmed to the Supreme Court, despite being the executive branch federal appointment because he was not confirmed by the legislature. The legislature also ratifies treaties as well as can declare war. This is to ensure that the people, to some extent, the people who are electing the legislative branch are the ones that primarily control whether we go to war or not. And so it needs to be popular enough for them to declare war. Congress also is in charge of appropriating money, and so it can use the control of the purse strings to really control a number of aspects, because even if the executive branch wants to carry out some goal, or the judiciary wants to do something, the legislature is the one that controls the money and the ability for them to carry that out. And so oftentimes they can exert control. The legislative branch also can exert control on state governments in this way. And then lastly, the legislature can impeach and remove the president. The House of Representatives votes to impeach, and then the Senate acts as a somewhat pseudo trial to determine whether the president should be removed. That's been in the news a lot in recent years, given the impeachment of President Trump, but not the removal of President Trump. And so if you're ever relying on data about that, I think that's the best modern example. In history, it's usually the president steps down if they've been impeached without having to go through the trial. So it's a really interesting role, and I think we have seen a lot of the legislature not really using this power, especially the Senate, to actually remove the president. So the president this check hasn't really served its role on the executive as much as the other items. And then we look to the checks on the judicial branch. A lot of people don't realize, but the legislature actually created the lower courts, the lower federal courts. That means the Court of Appeal and also the district courts. And because the Supreme Court is the only one that's constitutionally mandated in Article 3, but the legislature can create others and has created others below it. And so that has some measure of control about how the system works. And theoretically, the legislature could also take it back or rearrange it if the system wasn't working. The legislature can also impeach and remove judges. That has only happened once, I believe, in history of the Supreme Court being removed, though it can impeach and remove judges at all levels of government. But again, the legislative branch doesn't really use their impeachment and removal power very much. The legislature can also propose amendments to overrule judicial decisions. This is something that's really hard to achieve, but it's something that people often forget when seeing these Supreme Court decisions that come down that they don't agree with, that there is something that can overturn a Supreme Court decision about the Constitution, and that is a change to the Constitution. And then another aspect is, in addition to overturning decisions about the Constitution via an amendment, sometimes the Supreme Court is making a decision based on its interpretation of the legislature's laws that are put into place. And so if the legislature disagrees with that judicial interpretation, it can pass a new law to clarify that's not what it meant. And so this actually happens quite frequently, depending on the parties in the legislative branch. One thing that has prevented the legislature in particular from being an effective check on the other branches, which I've kind of hinted at here, is the political two-party system, which has driven a lot of the decisions going in the legislature and also created a lot of roadblocks from actually making any productive decisions, because there's a lot more people than the single executive branch or the 9 justices on the Supreme Court that they have to come together to decide things, and the different political parties have made that challenging. Next, we have the judicial branch. The Supreme Court interprets the laws, says what the laws are, which will be what I talk about in a little bit about judicial review. But the check on the executive branch and the legislative branch is essentially the same. The Supreme Court can declare executive actions unconstitutional and can declare acts of Congress unconstitutional, meaning that it is really the one calling balls and strikes of what the executive branch can and can't do and what the legislature can and can't do under the terms of the Constitution. And in addition, what I just mentioned before is that the Supreme Court and the other courts can also interpret the decisions of the legislature in saying what the law is in terms of what they've passed, not just whether it's constitutional or not, but what the actual laws mean when there's a dispute or when the legislature hasn't been clear. And also, there used to be a decision called the Chevron Doctrine, where the judicial branch the Supreme Court would defer to the executive branch when it wasn't clear on when the legislature issued a law that the executive branch was implementing, but the law was a little bit unclear. The Supreme Court previously used to give a lot of leeway to the executive branch in interpreting that law because the assumption was the legislature intentionally made it vague. But after a recent Supreme Court decision, now the legislature actually has to issue really clear doctrine, and the Supreme Court can interpret what the legislature's law says and will not defer to the executive branch in that area. And so that's a recent change that you'll probably encounter a lot in the case law as you are going through this program. And that is another check. It's forcing the legislature to be more clear in what it's saying and what it's delegating to the executive branch. And it's also not deferring to the executive branch in its interpretations and expertise in carrying that out. So that was a lot of information, but I would love to hear any questions that you have about that, about checks and balances. Okay, we got a question to me. What are the consequences of the judicial branch declaring an executive and actions unconstitutional? Well, the key consequence there is that the executive just can't do it. That's what the point of it is. It's to prevent the executive from actually carrying out and doing that role. There is a question of whether the executive branch listens to it. The Supreme Court, courts traditionally are a passive entity. And so there is somewhat of an open question of what happens when the executive branch refuses. It would be a constitutional crisis, but the Supreme Court doesn't have its own mechanisms to like force the executive to do something. But to the extent the executive branch or the president has any integrity at all of caring about the Constitution, then he would just not implement it. So a good example of this would be if DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals for children who came into the United States undocumented, but have been here for a certain amount of time. This was an executive branch ruling carried out, and to the extent the Supreme Court would say this is unconstitutional or too far of the scope, then that law would just not be enforceable anymore, or that executive order would not be enforceable anymore. So that's the primary rule. So, and oftentimes the Supreme Court won't say yes or no to something, but will kind of carve it out. So one of the famous Supreme Court decisions regarding Obamacare, which is the Affordable Health Care Act, basically decided that some parts of it were unconstitutional, but other parts were. And so it stripped part of it, but not the other part. And so just when it's being carried out, the outcome is that it would only, the constitutional aspect would be carried out. Is there any other questions?
Sabrina?
Yeah.
A question came in directly to me asking, in the We the People book, many chapters compare the US government's checks and balances with Britain's parliamentary government. What are some key differences between the US checks and balances and parliamentary government?
That's a great question. The main check is actually kind of interesting, and something I didn't really talk about is there's also checks between the two different houses of the legislature, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And those checks are like different roles so the Senate is supposed to be sort of more the deliberative body, whereas the House of Representatives is supposed to be more representing the popular vote and the popular will of the people. And so oftentimes when they make legislative decisions, they are at odds and checking each other in the scope of power that they have and allocating funds and how things get actually approved. But in the British system, I think it's a little bit more aligned in the legislature. And one thing that's important in Britain is that the Prime Minister, which is the equivalent of our executive branch, is actually decided based off of the legislature in the UK. So the way they do their voting is you vote for a party, and then whoever's the party wins, the members of that party appoint the Prime Minister. And so there's some parallels in how our system works, but the main difference is that it's even more party controlled than our system, and there's no voting directly for the executive, though oftentimes you'll have a sense of who the executive is. And so there's a closer connection, and there's something called the vote of no confidence in Britain, where the party can vote basically to remove the prime minister if they don't think they're serving the role anymore, and they can appoint someone new. So there's a lot more overlap between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So there's less room for the executive to sort of go off on their own. So there's a bunch of different differences, and I'm not saying all of them at the top of my head. But another aspect is that the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom is way less powerful compared to the US Supreme Court. And that's partially because the British system doesn't have a single constitution that's written out that sets out like clear rules. And so their role of judicial review is not as strong. I would say that their role is not really to tell the legislature or the executive branch what or what isn't constitutional per se, but more to interpret laws that are put in place. And so they don't really have the judicial review role that's as strong as in the United States. And I think that's really important to remember. So again, the executive and the legislative branch, primarily the legislative branch, I think has more power there. And just to clarify, even though they don't have a written constitution, they do have what's called common law, where these like the same kinds of principles that are reflected in our written constitution are in their system, but it's based off of common law, things that the Supreme Court, things that courts have interpreted, and things in a number of different written doctrines like the Magna Carta are preserved. But it's a little bit different of a system, less clear cut. And so I would say that there's less strong checks and balances compared to the US system. Do we have any other questions? Or if any CACE volunteers want to weigh in on anything I've talked about so far? Okay,
I'm just going to jump in for 2 seconds. This is a really useful chart to use throughout the year. I had this chart bookmarked on my computer the entire year. I referenced it probably every week. It's just nice to go back to, and I wasn't even dealing with these subjects directly. I was a Unit 5, so we were more in the weeds of judicial decisions, but we were still referencing it probably every week just to remember, oh yeah, that's where the court can be checked. It was really useful when we get a question that we weren't sure about, we could always come back to it. So it was this literal chart I had bookmarked the entire year. So if you guys ever want to go back to it, you'll always have the link to it in those from these CACE folders.
Great. Looks like we got another question. Is the British system something we've referenced in testimonies? That is a great question. Yes, this is certainly the case. I think primarily in the Unit 1 and Unit 6 questions, but it could come up potentially in other areas, in other units. But it's really important to remember that although this is a competition that's focused on the US system and the underlying principles of the US system, you need to understand the difference between our system and other systems, and primarily the British system, since that's where we came out of. That's where there's a lot of roots in the philosophical underpinnings that come from the British government. And the narrative of how our nation came together and how the Constitution was formed is really wrapped up in what we were running from the British government, and also what we learned from them. And so I think in particular, the British system is something that you'll want to be familiar with and kind of have a good sense of a comparison between them. Unit 6 will probably be well-versed. Unit 6 members will probably be well-versed in other countries in addition to the British system, but I think it's really important for every unit to understand it and the comparisons there, because you'll often get questions about that. Sometimes like not even what you think is relevant. It's like someone talking about due process, and then a judge might go, okay, well, how does our due process compare with other countries? And so understanding the British system is really important. And especially when you're comparing it to things like the checks and balances, and you want to be able to illustrate the difference and where the strengths and weaknesses come from. Because one thing I'll say is that the British government, although I personally believe that their checks and balances are less strong than ours, they also are able to make decisions a lot faster. And in our system, it's really roadblocked, especially because of the party system. So I think there are pros and cons to how those operate. Any other questions? Okay, well then I am going to move on to talking about judicial review. So you can, Nathan, you can put your screen down. Thank you. And this one doesn't have a handout. I'm just going to sort of talk about judicial review, which we sort of previewed. But before that, I just want to remind everyone that this program kind of operates with unit pairs. So there's going to be a pair between Units 1, which is about the philosophical underpinnings of our nation, and Unit 6, which is talking more about how our nation operates in the context of the rest of the world. And so those often go together because the philosophical principles and how they're carried out in other nations compared to ours are often linked. So in particular, if you're assigned Unit 1 or Unit 6, you should be paying attention to what those other units do. And then in addition, there's Units 2 and 4, which we often regard as a pair, and that's because Unit 2 is about the founding fathers and how the structures of government came into place. And then Unit 4 is how the federal government interacts with the state government and the multiple branches of government. So there's a lot of overlap there, and both those units, it's really important to understand the other units' context and scope because they often come up together. And then lastly, Unit 3 and Unit 5 are often viewed as a pair, and that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about with judicial review. Unit 3 is about the 14th Amendment, the Civil War, and also the incorporation doctrine. And then Unit 5 is about the Bill of Rights and how they play out in the United States. And so those often go together as well. So judicial review is really important to both Units 3 and Unit 5, and arguably all of the units. But that's why we're kind of talking about that today. And so I want to start off, I've been talking a lot at everyone. Can people either take off their camera, turn on their camera, and give an answer to this, or you can put it in the chat. But I want to know, what are some ways that the Constitution has changed over time? Any ways? All right, we got one answer, which is that new amendments and amending those amendments, such as the prohibition, that would be Amendment 18 and 21. We got expansion of voting rights, great. And then through amendments, we've seen changes through voting rights. So that's great. So I'm seeing a lot on amendments, which is what we sort of talked about earlier. So that's a hard change to the Constitution. And the most frequent one that comes up is the 14th Amendment. But I've also see some answers which are great too, and it's talking about its interpretation of the Constitution. That is a method of change as well. And I think that's a really important point to remember, because judicial interpretations are a way to change the Constitution. We have that example with Dobbs v. Jackson recently, which is interpreting that, overturning Roe v. Wade. So at one point, the Supreme Court said that Roe v. Wade was that abortion was a constitutional right in Roe v. Wade. But in Dobbs v. Jackson, the Supreme Court has undone that right. And so that is a form of change. And I think it's just really important to remember that, because a lot of times the questions will be really broad in talking about changes, or judges' questions will be really broad in talking about changes in constitutional rights. And it's important to remember that there's amendments and also judicial interpretation. And so with judicial interpretation comes the concept of judicial review. So judicial review is the idea that actions of the executive and legislative branches of government are subject to review and possible invalidation by the judiciary. This is one of the checks and balances that I talked about previously. And so the origins of judicial review come from common law and the British government, but a lot of people think that the source of it is in Article 3, which says that the judicial power of the United States vested in one Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress decides. And so, that's not that detailed, right? That's really not something that spells out what the judiciary is supposed to be doing. And so a lot of people say, so in Federalist 78, it was written that the interpretation of the laws is the proper and peculiar province of the courts. A constitution is, in fact, and must be regarded by judges as fundamental law. So it was viewed in Federal 78 by the founders that judicial review was fundamental to the judiciary's power and for upholding the Constitution. Because if the judges can't say what the law is, then or what the Constitution is, then the other branches of government could potentially step over it and just say that their own interpretation of the Constitution was correct. There'd be no entity saying what the law is and making things clear. A lot of people say that judicial review was established in the court case Marbury v. Madison in 1803. There, Justice John Marshall said, "It is emphatically the duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Those who apply the rule to particular cases must, of necessity, expound and interpret the rule. Two laws conflict with each other. The Supreme Court must decide on the operation of each." I don't think that this case actually established judicial review, but it did confirm it, did carry out and use an example. As we saw with Federal 78, the founders were already thinking that this would be what the role of the Supreme Court was. But Marbury v. Madison was the first time in American history that the Supreme Court used judicial review to strike down a congressional statute as unconstitutional. SCOTUS had previously used judicial review actually to uphold a statute's constitutionality in Hilton v. U.S. in 1796. But this was the first time the Supreme Court used its power to undo a congressional act. And so that is why it is so important and critical. And, throughout my time practicing law, Marbury v. Madison is often cited as the source of judicial review. But just remember that the founders always viewed a critical part of the Supreme Court to be the arbiter of what the law is, because that is how it checked the other branches. Now, the effects of judicial review are significant throughout history. The Supreme Court limited the power of the federal government in Barron v. Baltimore, 1833. It also practically started the Civil War in Dred Scott v. Sanford. And it also interpreted how the 14th Amendment would be incorporating the Bill of Rights to the states, which I will talk about in a little bit. It's also had a role in limiting executive powers in many different fields, including the war powers. In Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company v. Sawyer in 1952, it desegregated education in Brown v. Board of Education. It got rid of anti-miscegenation laws in Loving v. Virginia. It established the right of privacy in Griswold. It gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2012 with Shelby County v. Holder, and it legalized same-sex marriage in Obergefell. And there's been a lot of more recent Supreme Court justice decisions, like I talked about with Dobbs v. Jackson, that are undoing a lot of the saying what the law is from previous years. And so it's really important to remember that judicial review's power can shape every aspect of the US policy, every aspect of the other branches of government. All right, we're back. So before I get started on incorporation doctrine, we did have one question come in about judicial review that I wanted to address. The question is the power of judicial review limited by Congress's power to stop a case from going to the Supreme Court? Well, that's a great question. Congress is not able to stop a case from going to the Supreme Court. So the judicial review is not limited in that way. The main ways that judicial review is limited by Congress is through a constitutional amendment, or if the Supreme Court is interpreting a congressional act, Congress can change the act to be interpreted correctly if it disagrees with the Supreme Court's decision. The way a case comes to the Supreme Court is through the other levels of the court system. So it starts at the district court level and then goes to the Court of Appeal and then to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has a choice to take whatever cases it wants that are on appeal from the Court of Appeal. There's a certain range where it has what's called original jurisdiction, which are cases that have to be taken by the Supreme Court, but most Supreme Court can decide what cases to take. But still, at the end of the day, it's a passive body, so there has to be disputes that satisfy a bunch of different criteria, often talked about, it's called standing, which we don't need to get into now. But yeah, so Congress doesn't really have any authority over what cases do or don't go to the Supreme Court. Now, with that, we're going to talk about the incorporation doctrine. So I'm hoping Nathan can share screen to pull up our handy dandy chart. Perfect. Okay, so everyone knows about the Bill of Rights. There are the 10 rights set out that were passed shortly after the Constitution was put in place, and it lays out what Congress can do or not do, or the federal government can or cannot do. But the question is, what about the state governments? At the time the Bill of Rights was put in place, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. So although Congress could not get rid of free speech, technically a lot of states, unless their state constitution said otherwise, could impede on that freedom of speech principle. So the question is, at what point did states mean they're not able to, they were also governed by the Bill of Rights? And so that comes down to the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So although that's one section of the 14th Amendment, it's actually technically 3 different clauses that are regarded and talked about that you'll become very familiar with. The first is the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which is the first part of that sentence. And then it's the Due Process Clause, which is the life, liberty, and property without due process part. And then it is the Equal Protection Clause, which is the nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So the founder essentially of the 14th Amendment, John Bingham, intended for the 14th Amendment to incorporate the Bill of Rights to the states. However, it took a little bit to get there. There was initially kind of a debate about whether or not all of the rights should be incorporated all at once, or if a principle called selective incorporation would be put in place. So the first question was, what part of the 14th Amendment actually had this role? And the Privileges and Immunities Clause was the first attempt, and the one John Bingham actually envisioned would be incorporating the Bill of Rights to the states. But in the slaughterhouse cases, the court decided that the Privileges and Immunities Clause did not incorporate the Bill of Rights to the states. So the question became, what would? And so there became a process of selective incorporation where under the Due Process Clause instead, court would determine whether or not a right would be incorporated to the states. At this point, most rights are incorporated by now. And as you can see from this chart, it took a long time. So Gitlow v. New York was the first case to do freedom of speech, and also Stromberg v. California, which is a different aspect of freedom of speech. And then in Neer v. Minnesota was incorporating the freedom of press. DeJong v. Oregon was the right to assembly. Hague v. Congress of Industrial Organizations was the right to petition. Cantwell v. Connecticut was free exercise of religion. So all of those were the First Amendment, different aspects of the First Amendment, and they were the ones that were incorporated first at the earliest point. And then we have and I think I said Everson v. Board of Education. And then we have sort of more of the Sixth Amendment rights that come into place, and these are more the criminal side. And so there was Cole v. Arkansas, incorporated notice of accusation, In re Oliver, which was right to public trial, Wolf v. Colorado, which was the Fourth Amendment, incorporating no unreasonable searches and seizure, Mapp v. Ohio, Fourth Amendment for exclusionary rule. And you'll learn about a lot of these rights as you go through the process, especially Unit 5. Robinson v. California incorporated no cruel and unusual punishment. Gideon v. Wainwright incorporated right to counsel in felony cases. Malloy v. Hogan incorporated the right to no self-incrimination. Pointer v. Texas was the right to confront witnesses. Parker v. Gladden was the right to an impartial jury. Klopfer v. North Carolina, right to a speedy trial. Washington v. Texas, the right to compulsory process. Duncan v. Louisiana was the right to trial in criminal cases. Benton v. Maryland is the no double jeopardy rule. In the Arsinger case was the right to counsel for misdemeanors when jail time is possible. McDonald v. Chicago incorporated the Second Amendment's individual right to bear arms. And I just want to point out that this was in 2009. So it took that many years to incorporate the Second Amendment to the states. So all these rights about the Second Amendment and states not being able to regulate arms did not come into place until 2009. So a lot of that rhetoric you hear about the Second Amendment is actually coming from a pretty recent place in history, especially compared to these other rights. And then in 2019, the most recent was Timms v. Indiana, which incorporated the no excessive fines part of the Eighth Amendment. But there's still a number of amendments that haven't been, or parts of amendments that haven't been incorporated yet. The Third Amendment's freedom from quartering of troops in peacetime. That one hasn't been incorporated primarily because it hasn't come up at all. And there's been some creative legal theories out there. My judge that I clerked for in the federal district in District of Nevada has one of the few cases that was ruling on a Third Amendment case because people were trying to make creative arguments about police officers using someone else's home to stake out another criminal trial or individuals who were operating potentially criminal activity in a neighboring house. But most of the time that doesn't come up, and so it hasn't had a chance to be incorporated into the states. Then there is the Fifth Amendment grand jury trial, grand jury clause that hasn't come up, and then also the Seventh Amendment's right to jury trials in civil cases. So that's important to remember because if you are in a state court, you do not necessarily have a right to a jury trial in civil cases. And so sometimes there are different states that have different requirements for when a jury trial is appropriate. Most states allow a jury trial, but there are others that don't, or there are specific circumstances where it's not going to be valid. In particular, if it's a issue of, usually a division is an issue of equity versus like whether or not there's been a direct harm. So, and I just wanted to note that although all of these cases incorporate through selective incorporation, these amendments, those cases do not necessarily say in those particular situations that the amendment was violated. It just says this right, the states need to be governed by. So in Gitlow v. New York, for instance, it did incorporate the right to freedom of speech, but ultimately held that the state government of New York did not violate the free speech doctrine. So that's important to remember. So that is the incorporation doctrine. This is another one of those charts that I think is really helpful to keep handy, especially Unit 5, because these are kind of the cases that you should always be citing off the top as important cases establishing those rights to the extent you're going to be talking about those rights. So that was a lot of information. Do we have any questions? Seeing none. Oh, there is one. Do you have any tips for how to memorize and remember cases? I think one thing to keep in mind with this program, it's not just with cases, but all information, is there's sort of a curve. You'll feel pressure to feel like you need to know everything right from the start, but it's a gradual process. You are learning things, you are researching, finding new evidence, and then going to the analysis portion. And so there's going to be times where you kind of have a good idea of concepts, but not like you don't really have the evidence down yet. And that really just comes with time. So my biggest advice is just make the time to do the research and then get the evidence, but also give yourself some grace to have some time to learn it. In particular for memorizing and remembering cases, I think it's really important to link in your brain sort of a connection between the case and what you're actually trying to use it for, or what concept you want to go for. And so I think that that is the most important part of remembering cases, is linking it in your brain with like how it's going to be used. So instead of saying, this is right to free speech, this is right to press, is like saying, oh, freedom of speech involved these issues. Get low is one of those cases. And again, I think it just comes with time. I don't know if others have some advice from CACE about remembering things, but that's kind of what I did. I also had a lot of sheets like this that I created for myself that were related to different questions when I was in the program, and so that I would have them all in one place, and so I could just review them and keep reminding myself what it's like.
Yeah, to sort of add on in terms of like strategies for remembering what thing matches up with what issue, um, I really thought about it in terms of like what's the story. So, like remembering the story of Gideon v. Wainwright, or remembering the story of Gitlow v. New York, like that's what did it for me in linking it together, because I can't, like, I'm not a person that just off the top of the head, I'm like, ah, yes, this court case is this issue. I have to remember the context in which everything was and came before and yada yada yada. But yeah, that I mean, I also found it helpful because it gives that sort of narrative feeling when you're in competition. If you can tell the story along with your evidence, it makes it much more compelling. And that's an aside, but it's also a good tip.
Great. We had another question come through that's really great. It's, how has the Seventh Amendment ever come up in the Supreme Court and it just hasn't been incorporated, or has it just never come up? The Seventh Amendment, I don't remember the Supreme Court case off the top of my head, but it has come up, and it has been determined that the Seventh Amendment should not be incorporated into the states. And the reason for that is through the selective incorporation process, there's an analysis about historically whether or not the Bill of Rights was meant to be a check kind of for everyone in the government or restricted to the federal government. So in the case of the Seventh Amendment, the check was a intended historically to be a check of power on federal judges, and that those same sort of reasons for the purpose of the Seventh Amendment didn't really come into place in concerns from the state government wielding the same power. Does that make a lot of sense? I don't know. I'm not sure I really agree with that position, but that is what the Supreme Court has said on the matter. And so that's why it's not been incorporated. And won't be, unless the Supreme Court decides differently. But I will say most states allow for jury trials in civil cases, just they can limit the circumstances in which they do so. Are there any other questions? Okay, I got a question about not understanding the due process clause, and can you explain it further? Great question. So first of all, I just want to clarify that the due process clause, if you just read it by itself, which is, no any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. If you just read that, you're like, what does that have to do with like incorporation? Isn't it privileges and immunities of citizens? And again, the slaughterhouse cases determined that that's not what it was for. And so then we go to the due process clause. So the due process clause now has kind of been interpreted, and there's two aspects of it. So the life, liberty, and property without due process of law means sort of two things. There is the procedural aspect of due process of law, which is about the process in which a federal or state government can actually deprive you of certain rights. And so that's about the process. Did you have a right to an attorney? Did you get notice of accusation? They're kind of like making sure that the process was proper when they're depriving you of things like your life in the context of maybe the death penalty, liberty, restricting your ability to do something, or, you know, if you're going to jail, or property, they're taking your property away. So certain things need to be put in place. But then the other aspect is substantive due process. And that is a little bit more wiggly. It's more about what the federal or state government can actually do with respect to your rights. And so the Bill of Rights comes in because those are rights that are written down, that are concrete. And so this is saying that there really aren't any circumstances except where you can't take away these rights as a like substantive matter. So it's not about the process, but it's about those rights. And then in addition to the Bill of Rights, there's substantive due process in other areas. So we have the right to privacy, and we previously had the right to an abortion. But in Dobbs v. Jackson, the Supreme Court, and that's the one that took away the right of abortion, undid Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court's really questioning this idea of substantive due process rights outside of the Bill of Rights, and what the process should be. And they're saying that there needs to be a more strong historical connection to kind of create rights that aren't just in the Bill of Rights themselves. And so it'll be kind of an interesting thing to see how things change over time. So that's sort of the main thing with due process. It's substantive versus procedural. I hope that answers your question, but it is a complicated subject and something that you're going to be studying throughout the year when you're in this program. And so if you don't get it right now, that's okay. You have time to sort of learn it and work with your teachers. Do you have any other questions? Okay, great. So Nathan, you can put that screen down. Our next action is one of my favorite parts of the summer sessions, and it's giving you all an opportunity to take what you've learned today and at the last summer session and just get thrown into the process. So what we're going to do is I'm going to set up 11 different breakout rooms. There should be, I believe, 4 to 5 of you in each room. It's going to be random. So you'll be with people who aren't with your school, stuff like that. And you all are going to answer what is the most important right in the Bill of Rights. And so what you're going to be doing is actually, using Google Docs, writing a mock testimony answering that question. And this is, you're going to have to use analysis, bring in evidence, all that kind of thing. You can make it no more than 4 minutes. It'll probably be shorter, but you and your group have to determine what is the most important right. And so you will have an hour to do this in your breakout rooms, and we will have different CACE volunteers bouncing around in each room. All right, folks, I'm going to need everyone to put in the chat the rights they think are most important that your group discussed, or that you just think are most important, into the chat. You can send it directly to me or for the whole group. I'm going to put those options into a poll, and then we're all going to vote on them. So please send your chats right now. All right, folks, right now I have free speech, fair trial, free press, right against self-incrimination, and due process. Please put in the chat if you want something else to be in the voting poll now. All right, I am opening the poll now. We need one more person to vote. Very close. There we go. All right, and the winner of what is the most important Bill of Rights is free speech. And in second place is due process. So free speech got 51% of the votes. Due process got 32%. And then free press, fair trial, and the right against self-incrimination got were after that. So thank you so much for participating in this this session. I thought everyone did a great job of the presentations from what I saw. And I know it was fast, I know it was a lot, but this was designed to just show you that you can do it, and you can even do it in a short amount of time. So now, once you'll have a lot more time, you'll just be able to improve from here. Our next summer session is going to be next Sunday actually next Sunday this time, on August 4th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. And that will be focused primarily on Unit 1. And we will also be going over CACE tips and tricks to help you succeed. It will be the last summer session, and we hope you can make it. Our first summer session is posted on our YouTube channel, which I sent the link already. This one will also be posted on our YouTube channel, and we will also be recording summer session 3 as well. So hope to see you all next week. Thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.